So I've always been fascinated by World War II history, and there's really quite something about wrecked warships. The first ones I dived extensively were in Palau Island, where there's a number of large Japanese wrecks sunk and from the Second World War. And it was quite amazing to see just the debris around the ships and everything that just showed everyday life right before these ships were sunk. They had been at anchor a long time before they were attacked. The history of the wrecks in Coron Bay is a bit fascinating. This came when the U.S. Task Force 38, centered around the USS Lexington, was approaching Manila. And these ships that are sunk in Coron Bay had made an overnight run to Coron to shelter there rather than Manila Bay, which they realized was within range of the carrier task force's attack planes. So they sailed over to Coron Bay and thought they were safe, but they weren't. On the morning of September 24th, 1944, Task Force 38 launched 96 F-6F Hellcat fighters, some of which were serving as escorts and others which were armed with bombs to do dive bombing. And they sent 24 Curtis SBTC helldivers as well. The Japanese were caught unawares, and over a couple of raids that day, all of the ships were sunk. So it was really a devastating attack on the Japanese shipping, which was getting thin and fewer at the time anyway in the war. Another thing to mention would be the USS New York. That's in Subic Bay. It's a turn of the last century battleship that was in the Philippines in the 1940s. At the time, it was obsolete and it was just used as a coastal gunboat. It was scuttled in Subic Bay, where you can find some other wrecks too. And it's an amazing sight. Of all the wrecked ships, warships I've dived, it was the most incredible. It's at a relatively shallow depth on its side. It was scuttled by having charges blown in the side of it. So it's got a whole series of enormous holes in the hull facing up towards the sun. That side is up. And the amazing thing about it is, one, its scale, because it was a large ship, but two, it has never been salvaged. So it has propellers, guns, all its fittings. It was never dynamited, taken apart and stripped by salvagers. It wasn't stripped before it was sunk. It was scuttled when the Japanese were advancing because the US Navy didn't want it to fall into Japanese hands. And it's a pretty easy dive. The day I dove it, the sun was shining through those giant blast holes, and it was easy to swim through from one blast hole down a corridor to another because there was sunlight the whole way and it wasn't silty, so it was pretty safe. So some of the other dive sites I've been to in the Philippines that I should mention as well for people that are interested in diving in the Philippines. One was Malapascua Island, which is, about an hour boat ride. It's a really small place. It's right off the large island of Cebu, which has Cebu City as its capital, the second city, the Queen City of the Philippines, as they call it. So Malapascua is very worthwhile. It's a few hours bus ride out of Cebu City, and then, as I said, about an hour boat ride. It's a tiny place. It's not crowded. It's beautiful and enjoyable. It's known for being a dive spot where you can see thresher sharks. And I did make that dive with another American dive buddy. It was demanding. I would suggest, if you haven't been in the water for a while, to take a dive or two first before you do the thresher shark dive, because it's really high currents and somewhat deep. We unfortunately did the dive but didn't see the threshers. But there are some really beautiful coral sites off Malapascua. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about my trip out to Coron Island diving. Coron's part of Palawan province, and the dive area is Coron Bay, which is right off of Coron town. It was part of a trip with a couple of buddies that are also scuba divers. We went out there on a trip to Coron and also to Boracay. Ended up flying out of Manila on one plane and then taking a small plane across between the two island destinations. That was a really awesome flight because it was low level, a couple thousand feet over the sea. You could see the waves and the coastline and ships and so forth. Anyway, on to the diving. So Coron Bay is a great site to dive because there are 11 sunken Japanese warships, transports mostly, supply ships and the like. Some of them 150 meters or more long. The ships are sunk at various depths. Some are even run up partially on the shore, so they're accessible by scuba, they're accessible by snorkeling. And Coron town itself is a very nice place to stay. We stayed in a little simple hotel up on the hillside, which was fantastic, beautiful sunset views over the bay. And the wrecks were pretty amazing. As I said, at accessible levels, a number of them. They're large ships, so the dive trips are pretty easy because it's only a few minutes off the dock to the wreck sites. Note about finding a dive center there. I've had a dive certification from PADI, one of the large international dive certification organizations, since the 90s. It's an open water dive certification, and I've been fortunate to dive around the world, and including a number of wreck sites. However, visiting some of these dive shops out in Coron, they were pretty particular about their requirements, even though I'd done difficult dives and wreck dives previously. So we had to visit a couple of places in order to find an outfit that would take us, based, me and my buddy, on our length of experience, even though I don't have a logbook documenting everything. The other thing you want to watch out for when you're diving in the Philippines, when you talk to a dive shop, is obviously you have to have a good look at their equipment to see if its condition is good. But if you're a Westerner, I'm 5'10", it may be a bit challenging even to find gear that fits you comfortably. My buddy's a little over 6 feet, and some arrangements had to be made to make sure they had equipment that's big enough for you. But we got that sorted out and had a whole series of several days of good dives. And some of the wrecks we were able to penetrate because visibility was good and there was reasonably good lighting. And didn't do any deep penetrations or anything like that because I like to live. I don't want to get lost in a silted up wreck, but you could float into a few passageways and rooms on the wrecks, so it was pretty great. We did also dive another interesting location at Coron Bay, which is called Barracuda Lake. And it's an interesting little kind of volcanic bowl, it looks like to me, although maybe it was done by tidal action. And the appeal of it is not particularly barracudas. I think they just choose that as a catchy name. But it's about 50, 60 feet deep, if I recall, maybe a little deeper. But freshwater stream flows into it, and seawater flows into it as well. So it's a really neat example of brackish water. And brackish just means mixed sea and fresh, because the two types of water are clearly divided and visible. It's almost like if you put oil and vinegar in a carafe to make salad dressing. They separate because their densities are different. And so you could one, feel it, but you could also sense a temperature difference between the warm seawater and the cooler freshwater. And it made for very interesting dive around the cliffs of it. And you had to really pay attention with your buoyancy control, because when you went from the fresh to the salt, or the salt to the fresh, because of the changed density, you had to adjust your buoyancy so that you stay level. As I mentioned, on the same trip, we went to Boracay, and maybe I'll make a little presentation about that, but I was disappointed by Boracay. It's the most famous resort in the Philippines, but it's really a letdown. There's much better places to be found. Coron itself, the area is just beautiful. It's a mountainous island with the bay, and it's attracted a lot of expats and other people out to the area. So there's a nice food scene. It's not overly crowded. They are very environmentally conscious in Coron locally, which is not true in a lot of the places in the Philippines. So the sea is pretty clean. The dive sites are clean. Barracuda Lake was clean. There's things to do in Coron. Sometimes you go to a little more off the beaten path dive area, and there's not much there other than your remote dive hotel. This was not the case in Coron. There were a lot of cool restaurants and coffee shops, so it was really an enjoyable place to spend a few days. So that's a little bit of an overview of a few of the dive spots, and in particular Coron, which I really highly recommend. Hope you enjoyed it.